Would you like to improve your English pronunciation and communicate more clearly in English? Well, you're in luck because on today's podcast, we have a very special guest. Pronunciation coach Hadar is a non-native speaker of English who's going to share with you some valuable advice about how you can take your pronunciation to the next level. Welcome to Aprender Inglés with Hadar and Craig. Hello, and if you are a new listener to the podcast and this is your first time, you're very, very welcome. And if you've listened before, thanks for coming back. My name's Craig, and the aim of this podcast is to help you improve all aspects of your English and take it up to the next level. And today we're looking at pronunciation. Now, one YouTube channel that I always recommend to learners who ask me about their pronunciation and how to improve it is Hadar's channel, Accents Way English with Hadar. So naturally, I was really pleased when Hadar agreed to come on the podcast to help you with some pronunciation tips and advice. This episode is packed full of useful information, and among other things, Hadar explains how to use shadowing and how you can train yourself to improve your pronunciation if you're working at home with self-study. So take out your notebook, grab a pen and write these tips down. Trust me, your pronunciation will thank you. What's that? You don't have a pen and paper? Don't worry if you're driving. Never mind if you're at the gym. You can read the show notes and find links to Hadar's website and her YouTube channel in our show notes at inglespodcast.com/474. And now please enjoy my conversation with Hadar from Accents Way English. Hadar, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's really great to talk to you.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You're welcome. Well, the first thing I'd like to ask you is something I ask some people who come on as guests. Where's your accent from? How would you describe it?
I don't think I have a specific accent from a specific place because I have a long history with English. I'm a non-native speaker of English, so I'm originally from Israel. I speak Hebrew. And I moved to New York when I was 21. So I lived on the East Coast. So I picked up some elements from there and I studied Standard American as part of my acting studies. So I trained as an actress and I learned to speak in General American. So I speak General American with slight touches of East Coast dialect and also international English, I guess.
That's interesting because as a British speaker, we tend to focus on the south of England, the London River Estuary area as standard English. When you say standard American English, what part of the United States is that from?
So Standard American or General American is not a specific dialect from a specific place, but it's more of an umbrella dialect of northern white dialects from the East Coast and West Coast. And it's mainly prevalent in mainstream media and Hollywood. But I would say that the closest dialect to Standard American is the Californian accent or West Coast dialect.
Right. Yeah, but I can hear the New York sometimes when you're speaking on YouTube. I can hear the New York, the W at the end of you, and some other...
The aw sound, as in daughter. It's more rounded, yes.
Yeah, but I haven't heard you say coffee yet for coffee.
No.
So a lot of your focus is on native speaker pronunciation, and you train and you help people to sound more like a native American speaker. Is that fair to say? I mean, how important do you think it is to sound like a native speaker when people speak?
Actually, it's not important at all. My focus is not to help my students sound like native speakers, but only to optimize their ability to communicate in English. And a part of it has to do with understanding the challenges that they're experiencing when pronouncing words and sounds and speaking, and helping them understand what people expect to hear so that they could communicate in the clearest possible way. So I always prioritize clarity over accuracy if accuracy is how native speakers pronounce it. Now, of course, clarity has to do with the sounds as they are in standard dialects, but it's not that they must sound like native speakers. They just need to understand the elements that are important for their clarity and master them.
So people who come to you, what kind of reasons do they give you for helping them with their pronunciation? What are their aims? Obviously, they're learning English. What do they say to you? I want to improve because blah, blah, blah.
Well, first of all, they feel insecure. They understand that there is a gap between how English comes out of their mouth and how they hear it in their head or when other people speak, and they don't know how to bridge that gap. They feel that there is a difference in how they say sentences or specific sounds, and they don't know what they need to do to get closer to how it sounds in their head or how they know it's supposed to sound. The second thing is that they really experience communication challenges, whether it's at work or with friends, where they say something and they feel like the other person is not fully understanding them. And that creates insecurity and fear of communicating, the feeling of not being good enough, and that affects their fluency as well. So pronunciation is very much connected to fluency, because when you are able to master your pronunciation, not only that you sound clearer and more intelligible, but also you become more confident in communicating. It's easier for you to tap into words and to have them available, because when you practice pronunciation, you do a lot of repetitions, and that helps vocabulary be more accessible. And also you're confident in how to pronounce it. A lot of times people avoid using specific words because they have sounds that they don't feel comfortable with, or they don't know how to pronounce the word. So they limit themselves as they speak, and that affects their fluency. So I really attach pronunciation not just with how you sound, but how confident you are communicating and how fluent you are. And usually my students, they want that. Their ultimate goal is not just to sound like native speakers, but really to tap into their full potential, to not have any obstacle that gets in their way when communicating, and pronunciation is a big obstacle for a lot of speakers. So that is what their aim is, and I give them the tools by teaching them the foundations of pronunciation, but also the strategies on how to use it so that they can actually use it spontaneously when they speak.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I'm going to ask a very selfish question from a teaching perspective, because I have many students who are in the situation you've just described. And as a teacher, obviously practicing the pronunciation the way you've described it takes a lot of time. So how to start, whether you're a teacher or whether you're a language learner, how can they begin with improving their pronunciation features because they have Spanish, for example, as a first language, and they're confusing vowel sounds? It seems like a huge mountain to climb.
Yeah.
What's the best way to start? And also integrate it into other language learning features, like improving their grammar, improving vocabulary, etc.
Okay, so actually I believe that learning pronunciation is the foundation of everything, even improving grammar and vocabulary, because the way you learn pronunciation can be utilized to learning other elements of English, and I'll explain later. But for now, it's important for them to understand that pronunciation is just speaking habits. Their pronunciation in English and in Spanish or whatever first language they speak is just a habit that means that they don't think about it when they speak.
So
right? That is a habit.
They're using their mother tongue pronunciation features to speak English with. Is that
Exactly. So they're speaking English using the sounds, intonation, and rhythm of their first language, or new habits they acquired, because you may have new sounds that you have learned how to pronounce in the past or kind of like picked up on and then you're using. And these are your habits right now. And the only question is, are they serving you? Because if not, then they need to be convinced that it's important to work on. Especially with beginners, it's hard to get them convinced that pronunciation matters because they're like, it doesn't matter. I need to find the words. I need to understand grammar first. And pronunciation is luxury. But I really want people to understand that it's the foundation of everything. First of all, because of the practice, like I said, it's the way you practice pronunciation can be beneficial for everything else as well. But also because it creates the foundation for speaking and a healthy foundation. And you can create those habits from the beginning and not having to change them later. So they need to want it. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard for them to change. Because if they don't want it, they won't be committed. They won't do the work. And then there is no value in this type of work. And once they're convinced, then it could be very overwhelming to start learning everything about the language, all the vowels, all the consonants, all the elements of prosody, which is intonation, rhythm, stress, connected speech. Very overwhelming. So the way I go about it is I prioritize what is most important for them, what is critical for their clarity, first and foremost, not what makes them sound nicer or more pleasant for other people to hear, but what is critical for their clarity. For example, with Spanish speakers, there is a tendency of dropping consonants at the end when there is a consonant cluster, or substitution of B and V at the beginning of words. Now, that is critical because when you substitute consonants in English, it immediately affects your clarity, even more than when you substitute vowels, like sheep versus ship. But when you say bay instead of vey or vice versa, then it's a lot harder to understand because people don't expect that. So I would first teach them the main sounds that will make a huge impact on their clarity, and they would feel it. And once they feel it, they get excited about it. It's easier for them to communicate. Let's not forget that pronunciation is also an optimal way of pronouncing sounds. And a lot of non-native speakers, they get used to pronouncing a certain sound, like the R sound, with a lot of effort. If they don't learn it, right, then it would be, they would put a lot of effort. They would feel exhausted after speaking, and it would sound forced. So learning how to pronounce it would also make it very optimal in a way and will make it effortless for them to speak.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And although I tend to only focus on pronunciation in a general English lesson, is when communication breaks down, when the student has mispronounced the word to such a degree, maybe a misplaced stress on the word, that the other person doesn't understand what the person's saying, even though there's a context. So would you agree with that, or do you think it has to go a lot deeper?
100%. I think, and this is why I always work with the 80-20 rule, right? Like, what are the 20%? The elements that really prevent people from understanding them. Misplacing the primary stress is definitely one of them. Replacing consonants is one of them. And then gradually, I have a lot of students that want to master the flap T, like in the word Betty or party. Less relevant for you, Craig, because you don't have that.
Well, you say that. Yesterday I had a class with a lovely group of students and we listened to Jeff Bezos speaking on a short video on YouTube. And he said Amazon had to iterate. And I'd taught the word iterate, but I'd taught iterate with my English T
right
in the middle. So when he said it in connected speech with that T you're describing, iterate, they couldn't catch it. There's no way they could hear that word in there. It's interesting.
Especially if it's not a familiar word.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like a D.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I agree that it would be easier to learn, but some people are aware of it, and then they become self-conscious about that flap T, especially before an R, like party or order. It's a D, but it's the same sound. And it's not that important, because if you pronounce the T in party, you're still going to be clear. But if you pronounce, let's say, an S instead of a Z, that will affect your clarity more. So focus on what matters so you don't waste your time doing all this work and not seeing a lot of progress.
Yeah, that's good advice. You mentioned earlier, Hadar, prosody. How would you describe it to a student who doesn't know the meta-language around pronunciation? Because I love going into prosody and teaching it with my students. How can it make learners more effective speakers? Why should they care about it? Prosody.
Great. I love prosody, and when my students learn it, they fall in love with it too, because it is not as dominant in the language teaching industry or on YouTube as sounds, but it's sometimes a lot more important. So prosody is all the elements that are not the speech sounds, not vowels and consonants. It's everything that comprises a speech: intonation, rhythm, stress, connected speech, phrasing, pauses. And the way I like to explain it is, if we think about a musical piece, then sounds are the notes, but prosody is the volume, the rhythm, the tempo, the beat, right? Like everything that turns a musical piece into what it is. Or if you think about English as a work of art, then sounds would be the colors, and prosody would be the texture, the shapes, the lines, the spaces, everything that turns all these colors into a work of art. And this is why I think it's so important, because it is overall what gets people to pay attention, to listen, and to understand.
That's very well described. There's one example you used, the way you use analogies to language, I really enjoy. Recently you were speaking about word stress with the analogy of a party, the stronger stress being the really loud, boisterous people who make a lot of noise. They're the center of attention. And then you've got the secondary stress. They're a bit quieter, but they're in the middle of the room. And then the really weak, kind of hardly stressed people like me sitting in the corner with a drink, watching everybody else. I love that analogy. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, I'm a fellow introvert, so I feel you. I'm a schwa.
That's a surprising thing I've learned about you. I would never have thought that. So let's move on to something that is quite connected, and that's a technique I think people can use listening to this to improve their pronunciation by themselves. They could do something called shadowing or echoing. I've touched on this in a previous podcast, but how would you describe it, and how can learners use it to improve their pronunciation by themselves?
Well, a shadowing practice is basically where you take a resource. Ideally, you'll have the script and a speaker that, and you need to like it. You need to to get excited about it, whether it's a monologue or a speech or a dialogue or an interview, someone that you resonate with their voice and their message. And basically what you do is you, just like the word says it, you shadow. You repeat the person, paying attention to the elements that you want to focus on. So you could do general shadowing where you just shadow, you try to imitate the melody or the sounds that you're hearing. But I like to do what I call intentional shadowing, where you repeat the person. And for those who don't know what it is, then just to be more specific, you can either play an audio or a video and repeat the person, like just on top of it, like a split second after, just to repeat it like an echo. Or you can pause and repeat. So you play a sentence or a chunk or a unit, and then you pause it, and then you repeat, and you try to make it as precise as possible.
That would have to be a very short piece, right? So that they could remember what the words are.
Yes, exactly. Like a short piece, or if they have the script in front of them, then that could be a little longer. If they do have the script, I also like to mess around with the script a little bit to divide it into thought groups or sentences so it's really clear, and I kind of like rewrite the script the way I hear it. So I have a visual reference of what I'm hearing. And I think that intentional shadowing, which I find to be more effective, is that you do the shadowing, but you focus on one or two elements that you're trying to improve. So for example, if you want to improve your R, let's say you use the R sound or ra, and you want to switch it with the American So when you shadow the person, you pay close attention to the R sound. So you're more intentional about how they pronounce the R sound and how you pronounce it, so that you get the benefit of everything else: intonation, rhythm, stress, tone of voice, pace, but you're also more focused on that one particular sound. And this is how you can feel progress. Because if you're not paying attention to anything, how would you know if you're improving?
Exactly. And if you want to go to Hadar's YouTube channel and see this in action, the video I recommend that I really enjoyed was White Lotus, the White Lotus TV series. And thank you, Hadar, because I had never heard of it before I watched your video, and then I watched both series. So, very, very enjoyable. And yeah, she does a fantastic job. So go to Hadar's YouTube channel and have a look at the White Lotus video on shadowing. Do you have any other tips and advice for learners to improve pronunciation by self-study by themselves?
Yes. So I can share with you the way I teach my students, and I teach them how to teach themselves. And when you are trying to learn a specific sound, let's say you want to master the difference between the sheep and the ship vowel pair. So the first thing is perception. You have to be able to consistently hear it, because if you can't hear it, you can't make it. If you only have one E sound in your language, you might not even recognize that there is a difference if you don't see the difference in the spelling. So you have to pay close attention until you hear the difference. So perception is key. Then you want to make sure that you're able to pronounce the sounds correctly. And that's where you focus on your articulation organs, what you do with your mouth, your lips, your teeth, your tongue. And then you try to understand how it is different from your own sound, from how you pronounce it, right? So I always compare it to their L1 pronunciation.
Their first language.
Their first language, yeah. So if they say sheep, and I want them to say sheep, they need to understand what is the difference between those two sounds. And they can do it on their own, like just try to understand what is different. And then once they understand the pronunciation, then they need to turn it into a habit. And that's all about repetition. So repetition is key. And here I like to start with words, then using these words in phrases, because it's always easier to say it in single words. And then in phrases, we forget about it, right? So then in phrases, then maybe in minimal pairs, like sheep, ship, reach, rich, least, list, to see that they can make the difference. And then in sentences, and then in texts, or just to do a shadowing practice, paying close attention to this one vowel that you're trying to improve, or vowel pair. So repetition is key. So you turn it into a speaking habit, but then you want to practice intentionally. So after you do the repetitions and the shadowing, you want to practice speaking freely, but being aware of the sound. Again, that's intentional speaking. And I think that part is mostly missed by learners. They do the work, they practice, they repeat the sounds, and then they're surprised why they are unable to use it when speaking. The reason is because you probably haven't turned it into a habit and you need to repeat it more, but also you're missing a step, which is intentional practice. You want to practice speaking and being very, very attentive to that one sound. And if you feel that you're mispronouncing it, to pronounce it again. Because you don't want to think about it when you talk to friends or when you're at work, right? So this is why the self-study, intentional practice, when you record yourself and listen back to it, is very, very effective. And people tend to skip that part because it's tedious and sometimes boring and annoying, and listening to your voice, like people don't like listening to their voice, but hey, it works.
Yeah, you have to put in the work. So notice the difference basically in how you're speaking and how a native speaker would pronounce the same word or phrase, and then starting that habit to drill in the adjusted pronunciation so that it becomes part of the way you speak. You've spoken quite a bit about mindset, Hadar, and I think your last podcast and YouTube video spoke about the way we develop our mindset to approach learning languages. Now, starting a habit, I've spoken a lot about that on the podcast. People who want to get in shape speak about it, but they don't really do exercise. They want to learn to cook, so they're always watching cooking shows like MasterChef and Gordon Ramsay, but they're not actually cooking. So for people who need to improve their pronunciation, any tips or advice to start doing that habit and integrating it into their daily routine?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, to understand that it has to happen daily. But to make it a daily habit, it has to happen daily, because if you do it twice a week, first of all, it's going to be hard to stick with it. You're going to forget 1 week and then another week and then 3 weeks go by and you don't do anything. So it really is important to turn it into a daily habit. And for that to be possible, you have to make it sustainable. So no one's expecting you to practice for a full hour or 2 hours every single day. That is not feasible in the long run. So you have to, first of all, recognize that even 10 minutes of practice are valuable as long as you do it every single day. That is the compound effect. You don't feel the difference from day 1 to day 3 to day 5, but 2 weeks later or 2 months later or 1 year later, you will feel massive changes in your speech and pronunciation, your ability to learn something and put it into practice. So developing a 10-minute daily habit is very important. Now, one of the things about habits is that you want to maybe stack it with another habit that you do daily. So a lot of my students do it first thing in the morning after they drink their morning coffee. Or you want to attach a reward to it. I'm not going to get to lunch until I finish my 10-minute daily practice. Because the reward, which is something that is really important when building habits, is not immediate when you practice pronunciation. So you need to create like an artificial or external reward, right? I'm going to get to be on social media for 10 minutes. I'm going to go to lunch after, and then it's easier to keep it. And just keep track of it. Make it fun. Gamify it. Make a long, create a streak or use a phone app to track your progress. But it's something that you need to be very intentional about. And when you do, then it doesn't, of course, it's important what you do. But even if you just listen closely to someone or shadow someone for 10 minutes, it is still valuable.
Absolutely. Just to be clear, you mentioned stacking habits before. That will be when you do a habit that's connected to a previous one. Yeah, like washing your face and then cleaning your teeth, or having your first coffee and then doing your 10 minutes pronunciation exercises.
Right. So you always attach it with a habit you already have, something that you routinely do every day without thinking about it.
Yeah. I had a student recently who did his pronunciation or his English practice in the car on the way to work. So that was his time. He was on his own. He was away from his kids and his family. He put on a podcast in the car and then did some shadowing, did some repetition. And then you can speak as loud as you like. Nobody hears you. You're in your car. So that's a good idea.
This is such an important point because you have to create a safe space for you to practice, especially pronunciation, right? You want to feel free and you don't want to feel judged. And sometimes when we do it around other people, people have things to say. And that is discouraging. So you want to create the right environment for you to succeed, which means to remove all friction, right? Like not be around your phone, around people who will discourage you.
Yeah, that's good advice. Before you go, I have 2 off-topic questions. Mm-hmm. The first one is, have you changed your mind about anything recently? Can you tell us one thing you've changed your mind about?
Not necessarily related to English, right?
Anything. Could be anything.
Yeah. Okay. So camping. I used to hate camping, really. Like I would hear it and I would start itching. And then recently, my partner took our daughters out camping without me, and they had an amazing time. And I saw the photos, and I got so jealous.
You were missing out, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. They used the right strategy to get me excited about camping, and now I am looking forward to it.
I've gone the other way, totally. I used to go camping with my wife. Now, we don't have kids. I understand it's great for the kids, but for me, I'm like, why would I want to sleep in like a homeless person if I can afford to go to a hotel and not have the bugs and the spiders? Why would I sleep on the floor? But I get it. If you've got a family, it's a different mindset.
But, ask me again after I actually go camping and, let's see what my answer is.
Yeah, make sure you take a nice, comfortable mattress with you. Because, Hadar, what one thing, if you were to tell someone about yourself, would they find it difficult to believe? Now, you've already mentioned one. You can't repeat the fact that you're an introvert. Can you tell us something else that's surprising that maybe you haven't talked about before?
I might have talked about it with my students, but I flew a plane once.
Wow.
That is, something that is unlikely for a person like me to have experienced. But yeah, I did. I was a simulator instructor, and in my early years when I was 18. And as a bonus, I got to fly a plane. I didn't take off and land, thankfully. This is why I'm still here. But I pretty much did everything else.
They gave you the controls while you were in the air.
Yeah. And we did
Amazing.
some, aerobatic things and loops and stall turns. And now I am afraid of flying. So I just don't know where I had the courage to do all of those things. Because now I'm like, I get in a plane and I'm terrified. So things that happen when you grow up, grow older.
Yeah, you have a family. Yeah, I jumped out of a plane once, but but I don't think I would do it again because it wasn't very enjoyable. Hadar, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. All the links to everything Hadar has spoken about will be in the show notes. And thank you so much. I hope we can do this again sometime.
Craig, thank you so much. It was a lovely conversation. Thank you for the great questions, and thank you for letting me be here.
Thank you very much, Hadar, for sharing such useful and practical advice. And thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. HadarShemesh.com is where you can find out more about Hadar. And don't forget her YouTube channel. And you can find links to those and her Instagram. Go to the show notes for this episode at inglespodcast.com/474. And now it's your turn to practice your English. Do you have your own method, techniques, and resources to improve your pronunciation? We'd love to hear them. We'd also like to know if you enjoyed this episode and if you have any ideas for future podcasts. So, why don't you practice your pronunciation and send us a voice message? Don't forget what Hadar said about repetition. Record your voice message many times until it's the best it can be, and then send it. You can do that on SpeakPipe. Go to SpeakPipe, speakpipe.com/Inglespodcast. And remember, you only have 90 seconds to leave your message. If you would like to leave a longer message, you can send me an email to craig@inglespodcast.com. And to write to my regular co-host, Reza, send your emails to belfastreza, REZA, @gmail.com. This podcast is sponsored in part by mansioningles.com. Why not visit the online store and have a look at our paid courses? You'll find those at store.mansioningles.net. And before I go out the door today, I'd like to thank all of you who are helping us by supporting this podcast on Patreon. And you too can be a wonderful supporter on our Patreon program for as little as $1.50 per month. And when you sign up and become a supporter, you get instant access to all of the podcast transcriptions. For more information, go to patreon.com, patreon.com/Inglespodcast. I don't have time to thank you all individually if you're on the Patreon program, but we would like to say hi and thank you to our most recent supporters who have joined us this month. And they are Diego Perez, David Lopez, Soledad Garcia Rodriguez, John, Valerie Neyali Villanueva, Manuel Sandoval, Isabel Melian, Alba B, Tony Esteve, and Miguel Lopez Costella. Thank you to you and to everybody who's supporting us on Patreon. I'll be back next week with Reza, and we'll have another podcast for you. Until then, have a fantastic week. Thank you for listening this week. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please tell your friends so that more people can listen. Hello? Are you still there? If you've got this far, if you are still listening when the music is playing, you are truly an AIRCaholic and true fan of the show. Congratulations. We're proud of you. And obviously, you want to improve your English and take it up to the next level. But is listening to this podcast every week enough? Will it get your English, especially your speaking, to the level you want? I'm suggesting you join me and a small group of motivated students in my online conversation course. We meet every week on Zoom, and I help you to improve your fluency, your pronunciation, and your vocabulary. So if you get a bit frustrated when you speak English and you want to boost your confidence and be a more effective speaker, send me an email to craig@inglespodcast.com and I'll give you more details. And once again, thanks for listening, and I hope to see you on the inside. The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.